Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. Today our focus is going to be on the company LyondellBasell, ticker LYB. They are a chemical company and I first bought into them about 4 years ago. In this video, we'll take a quick minute to look at their financials, then perform a stock valuation, then we'll look at my purchases into the company, and at the end of the video, we'll look at my portfolio performance. So let's jump right into it. First off, we see several down years in red, including the two most recent years, and management addressed this in their recent earnings call, indicating that the industry has been in an extended down cycle, so this is not just impacting Lyondell. Now, starting off at the top with revenue over the last 10 years, growth has been flat and actually slightly down about 1% since 2014. Next, net income and earnings per share, both of these are also lower since 2014 and declining over the past 2 years. Then two data points I always like looking at. First is dividends, which I like to see increasing over time, which Lyondell has increased more than 80% over the decade. Also, on occasions, they do pay a special dividend, which they did back in 2022 at $6.39 and in 2019 at $15 per share. And these special dividends are on top of their normal dividends that they pay. Then share count, which I like seeing on the decline, and since 2014, Lyondell has repurchased more than 35% of their outstanding shares, so a great sign there as well. Next, free cash flow, just like revenue, not much growth, and slightly down since 2014, and the highest year being back in 2021. So let's jump down now and we'll perform the stock valuation setup, and we'll look at making a modification in a moment. And if you get any useful information, I ask you to consider liking and subscribing to the channel. But for the intrinsic value, I have $126.33, and with a 85% margin of safety, brings that down to $107.38. Now, this is based on a short-term growth rate of 0% for the next 10 years with a 10% discount rate, and I am using a 3% long-term growth rate. Now, up here in the top right, we have the net income CAGR and earnings per share CAGR for the last 10 years. And as we discussed in the financials, it is down. We've seen net income down just over 7%, while the earnings per share down just over 2%. Now, I did discuss this during the financials as well, that the past 2 years has been somewhat of a down cycle for this industry. So hopefully that can recover in the next year or so. But this is why I'm using a 0% short-term growth rate. And we also saw that revenue and free cash flow hasn't really increased either over the past 10 years, but they are making cash every year. So free cash flow has been positive. So that is a good sign. And this is why I'm being conservative, showing that 0% short term growth rate for the next 10 years. And the stock is currently trading around maybe $102 to $104 or so in that range, maybe slightly above 104. But let's say if I'm being a little too conservative, let's drop this 10 years of zero growth down to 5 years and see what happens. So with 5 years of 0% growth, intrinsic value jumps to $135.21. And with that same 85% margin of safety, brings it down to just under $115. Now, I do think this opportunity here, as I said, I do own this stock, though I haven't purchased any recently. Last time I bought in is probably a couple months ago. And one thing about Lyondell, since owning it for a couple of years, it doesn't really ever trade at a premium. It's not a high-tech company, so you shouldn't expect that. And it typically does get up to my intrinsic value or slightly below it, but don't ever expect it to trade at a high premium. But let's move on and we'll look at a few other data points. So first, PE ratio 16.5. So that's typically in that value opportunity range. But I will point out that Lyondell typically trades at a low PE ratio, and it's not uncommon to see it even lower than this. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking about buying into the stock. Long-term debt to free cash flow, I like seeing under 3. You can see this slightly above that, so not a big concern there. And then dividends, as we discussed in the financials, it has increased over the last 10 years. We see up 83% and has a dividend yield of 4.8. So nice sign there. And as I mentioned in the financials, occasionally they do pay a special dividend. Back in 2022, it was $6.39 on top of the normal dividend. And in 2019, it was like $15 a share on top of the normal dividend. So if you get a year with a special dividend, you're usually going to make out pretty well. Share count, again, as we discussed in financials, it's down just over 37%. So another great sign there. And then net profit margin, I normally like seeing 10% or higher. And we can see here for the last 10 years, they're 10.2. In the last 3 years, slightly below that 10% at 8.3. So hopefully as the market improves, they can start improving their net profit margin and getting up to that 10% or higher. Now, one other data point I really like looking at and very important for investors is return on invested capital. And again, I like seeing 10% or higher. You can see in those earlier years, they have achieved that. Let's see, 13.6, even up in 10 years ago. And the most recent 1 year, slightly below that 10%, 8.2. So again, hopefully they can get that back up again. They have achieved 10% or higher, and I'm hoping they can return to those levels. So let's move on now, and we'll look at my stock purchases into Lyondell. Here are all my purchases into LyondellBasell, and my first one was made back in April of 2020. And you see I made various purchases throughout the past couple of years. And one thing to my surprise was that the stock gains during this time, most of my purchases have actually been underperforming the S&P 500 ETF. And the only ones that are actually beating it are the ones I highlighted in green with the initial one, and then these two back in September of 2022. However, up here you see the total returns to include dividends. I'm up almost nearly 70%, while if I take into account dividends with the S&P 500, I'm only up just under 54%. So these dividend payments that Lyondell pays is what's helping me beat the S&P 500, which I was actually a little surprised when I pulled this table together. I didn't realize that the stock gains in Lyondell would be trailing the S&P 500 as much as it's shown here. But those dividends, it's what's helping me beat the index. And over here, see my cost basis at $71.42. Now, I will point out that my dividends from Lyondell are about $5,000 during this time period, and I checked the S&P 500 ETF, which is about $1,100. So far, I made about 5 times the dividends in Lyondell than I would have with the S&P 500, which is helping me beat the ETF. And if we scroll down here, you see my total investment into Lyondell. My total investment is about $25,000, and with the gains of about $11,000, the current value is $34,577. And then, as I mentioned, on top of that, I've received the dividends, which is about $5,000 during the time period I've held the stock. So let's move on now and look at the portfolio overall performance. Here's the portfolio's overall performance, and LyondellBasell is down towards the center right. And size-wise, this position is about average and comparable to my Snap-on, SNA, Patrick Industries, PATK, Toll Brothers, TOL, and a few other investments I have. Though it's not nearly as big as some of my larger ones, such as Berkshire, BRKB, and Palantir, PLTR. Now, one other investment I'll point out is FMCC. This is more of a speculation play. And if people are interested, I can do a video on that. So just to let me know. But I hope you enjoyed this video, got some useful information. If so, consider subscribing. I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.